Montana Territory, June of 1879. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain, and the girl on the porch had a rifle laid across her lap like it was part of her. Helena Addler sat still, eyes fixed on the narrow trail leading through the trees to her cabin. She had not seen a soul in 4 days. Before that, it had been weeks. The chickens were quiet, the firewood stacked high, and the silence once a comfort felt too loud now. She had been alone too long. Inside, 2 small voices argued over a tin plate. Bonnie and Bethany, her twin daughters, only 6 years old, all hair and questions and scuffed knees. They were her world, and the reason she had kept going after the fever took her husband 4 winters back. But something in her had emptied out since then, and she had not known how hollow she had become until the loneliness started to ache like a bruise. A horse's hooves pulled her up straight. She stood, rifle ready, the twins quieting behind the window. A rider crested the hill, tall in the saddle, lean frame steady as a post. Dust clung to his coat and his hat shadowed his face, but as he got closer, she saw the way he held the reins easy, like he trusted the land. Like he belonged to it. He stopped 10 feet from her porch. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, voice low, sure. "Name's Weston James. Heard there was a woman out here needing supplies. Trader and Helena said you might be short." She blinked. "I did send word, but that was weeks ago. Storms took out the bridge, had to circle south. Brought flour, salt, and coffee." He nodded toward the pack mule behind him, "and some candy sticks for the little ones." Helena lowered the rifle. "You came all this way," he slid down from the saddle, nodding. "Figured if you sent word, it mattered." She watched him unload sacks from the mule, arms strong and quiet in his work. The girls cracked the door open, wide-eyed. Bonnie stepped out barefoot, her braids swinging. "You brought candy?" she asked. Weston crouched to her height and pulled a cloth bundle from his satchel. "Sure did. You must be Bonnie. And you," he said as Bethany peeked out behind her sister, "must be Bethany." Helena's heart twisted. "How did you know their names?" He looked up at her, calm. "Your husband, Thomas Addler, served with my older brother in the war, wrote letters about his homestead, his girls." Weston stood. "When I heard he passed, I figured I owed it to him to check on his family." She stared at him, chest tight. "That was years ago. I was in Texas. Took me time to get north." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind stirring the trees behind him. "You want a plate of stew?" she asked finally. He nodded once. "Would be grateful." The stew was thick with potatoes and rabbit, and Weston ate with slow gratitude, seated at her kitchen table while the girls sat cross-legged on the floor, watching him like he was a storybook come to life. "You always travel alone?" she asked. "Usually." He sipped from the tin cup. "Work comes in pieces. Ranch hands need help, trail bosses lose men, someone always needs another set of hands. I go where it takes me." "You planning to move on soon?" He looked at her. "Not sure yet." She lowered her gaze, stirring her stew. Her hands were scraped from chopping wood, her sleeves patched at the elbows. She had stopped thinking of herself as a woman a long time ago, just a mother, just a caretaker. But when he looked at her like that, she remembered she was still something more. "You lost someone?" she asked quietly. "My brother," he said. 4 years ago, fever took him, same as your husband." "I am sorry," he nodded. "Me too." The girls climbed into her lap, tired from the excitement. She held them close, and Weston watched her with a look she could not name, something steady, something soft. "I have been alone too long," she said before she could stop the words. He set down his cup. "Then it is time you were not." She froze. He was not smiling. He was not teasing. He said it like it was a promise. He stayed 3 nights. Said he wanted to fix the fence, help stack the woodpile higher. The girls followed him everywhere, asking questions, laughing louder than they had in months. Helena kept her distance at first, but each evening when he sat on the porch, she found herself sitting too. They talked about the land, the way the stars looked different in Montana than Texas. He told her about wild horses running free near the Rio Grande. She told him how Bonnie once tried to saddle a goat. The third night, after the girls had gone to bed, he handed her a cup of coffee. She took it, hand brushing his. "You do not have to stay," she said, voice low. "I know," he said. She looked at him then, really looked. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the scar near his jaw, the patience in the way he waited said nothing more. "But I want you to," she said. He reached out slowly and took her hand. "I am glad," he said. And just like that, something shifted, not loud or sudden, just a quiet click like something had found its place. The next morning he saddled his horse. The girls clung to his legs. "You coming back?" Bethany asked. He lifted her, kissed her forehead. "You want me to?" "Yes," Bonnie said. He looked at Helena. She nodded. "Soon," he smiled, eyes warm. "Soon." And he rode off down the trail, the dust rising behind him, the girls waving until he disappeared. Helena stood on the porch, her heart full in a way it had not been in years. She had been alone too long. But not anymore. The first snowfall came early that year, dusting the tops of the lodgepoles and softening the edges of the world. Helena had just finished boiling down the last of the chokecherries, when hoofbeats pressed faint impressions into the whitened trail again. Weston James arrived with a wool blanket tucked behind his saddle and a rifle strapped across his back. His horse looked leaner than before, and there was a fresh patch sewn into the shoulder of his coat. He dismounted without speaking, his eyes sweeping the cabin and the yard, then landing on her quiet and steady as the first time. "You hungry?" she asked, brushing her hands on her apron. He nodded once, pulled off his gloves. "I've been riding since dawn." That night, he slept on the floor near the hearth, same as before. The girls had grown used to his presence quickly, like he'd slipped into the rhythm of their lives with no fuss. Bonnie pressed a handful of dried corn kernels into his palm before bed. He accepted them like they were silver. In the days that followed, he cleared the snow from the barn roof with Helena, both of them working in a shared silence that never felt strained. He never asked for more than a place to sleep and a plate at the table, but he started rising early to split kindling before the sun rose, and once she caught him quietly fixing the latch on the girl's toy chest. One evening, while she mended a tear in Bethany's dress, Weston stood by the window, watching the sky darken. "Did you ever think about leaving here?" he asked. She didn't look up. "When Thomas died, I almost did, went as far as packing a trunk. But the girls, this land felt like the only things left that still knew me." "You'd never go now." "I don't know," she said. "I'm not sure what's waiting beyond these hills anymore." He turned from the window. "Maybe not what's out there, but who's with you." She set the dress aside and leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You always talk like you've already seen the end of things." "I've seen enough to know what matters takes time. And roots." Helena hesitated, then stood and crossed to him. Her fingers brushed the edge of his coat where the stitching had begun to come loose. "You didn't patch this right," she said. He looked down at her hands, then back at her face. "Didn't have the thread. I have some." They stood close enough to feel each other's breath. The fire cracked behind them, the girls asleep in the next room. He didn't move, neither did she. "Helena," he said, voice low. "Don't say anything," she answered. "Just stay." He did. Through the long winter, Weston remained. He didn't speak of leaving, and she didn't ask. When snow built high against the cabin walls, he shoveled paths to the henhouse. When a fox took one of the hens, he set traps with quiet precision. They fell into step without needing to explain how. One night in early February, when the cold was sharp enough to freeze breath in midair, Helena woke to find him standing near the door, wrapping his coat around his shoulders. "You going somewhere?" she whispered. "Just out to check the traps." She stood and crossed to him, pulling the coat tighter around him before he could. "You'll lose fingers if you go out like that." He didn't move. "I've worked through worse." "I don't want you to," she said. He looked down at her, something unreadable in his gaze. "You don't," she shook her head. "I want you warm, I want you safe, I want you here." He breathed in through his nose, quiet and deep. "I've never had anyone say that to me." "Well," she said, her voice catching, "you do now." He bent, pressed his forehead to hers. "Then I'll stay here. Long as you'll let me. I'm not asking for someone to rescue me." "I know," he said, brushing a knuckle along her cheek. "I'd never think you needed one. Just someone to stand still beside me. I can do that." They stood there, the cold wind slipping under the door, the fire burning low. And they didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. By the end of February, the girls had started calling him West, like it was the most natural thing in the world. He carved them whistles from pine branches and taught them how to read the shape of deer tracks in the snow. Helena found herself smiling more. Not the tight-lipped kind she used to wear for the girls, but soft, full ones that started from somewhere deeper. One afternoon, as she handed him a tin of boiled beans, she said, "You planning to build something of your own again someday?" "I reckon I already have." She didn't answer right away. "You mean this place?" He met her eyes. "No, I mean you." She didn't need to say anything. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. And in that quiet kitchen filled with the sound of children's laughter and the scent of stew simmering on the stove, something settled between them for good. The wind outside no longer sounded like emptiness. It sounded like home. The thaw came slow that spring. Ice clung to the northern side of the bluff well into April, and the creek behind the cabin ran high with meltwater, churning brown and fast over stones that had been dry since autumn. Helena kept to her planting schedule, her hands deep in the soil before the frost had fully lifted, stubborn as ever. Weston set fence posts along the southern edge of the pasture, where the ground had softened enough to drive them in without splintering. One afternoon, with the sun high and the air finally warm enough to shed coats, Helena brought a pail of water to where Weston knelt, tamping earth around a cedar post. "You always work like the land owes you something," she said, holding out the tin cup. He drank deep before answering. "I figure if I keep my hands moving, I don't start thinking on things I can't change." She lowered herself beside him, the knees of her skirt catching burrs in the grass. "What is it you're trying not to think on?" He didn't answer right away, just leaned back on his heels and watched a hawk ride a current overhead. "My mother died when I was 16, he said finally. "My brother and I buried her behind the house. He was just turned 18. We left the same week to join the cavalry, thought we'd come back after." Helena's eyes stayed on the horizon. "I never knew my mother. She died giving birth to my younger sister. My father raised us best he could, but he was half wild and gone more often than not." Weston nodded once, then began patting dirt again with the flat of the spade. "Maybe that's why we both ended up out here. Looking for something the world forgot to give us." She stood, brushing her hands on her apron. "Or trying to build it ourselves." That night, Helena caught Weston outside after the girls had gone to bed. He stood near the tree line, arms crossed, watching the stars emerge one by one. "You always go quiet this time of day," she said, stepping beside him. He tilted his head, listening to the frogs starting up near the creek. "Evening's the only time nothing asks anything of me." "I think it just asked you to listen," she said. He looked at her, then reached down and took her hand. She let him. "I've got an offer," he said, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. "Sheriff in Three Forks needs a deputy. Said I could start come June." "3 Forks is nearly 2 days' ride," she said, heart sinking before the words finished leaving her mouth. "I told him I'd think on it," Weston said, "but I won't take it if it means leaving this." She stepped closer, voice steady. "You don't owe me promises. I'm not offering them out of debt." He let the silence stretch between them until a breeze lifted her hair from her shoulder. "I'd rather mend fence and raise chickens than carry a badge again," he said softly, "if it means staying with you." Helena didn't speak. Instead, she leaned in and rested her forehead lightly against his chest, just once. He folded his arms around her without urgency, like he'd been waiting to be still that way for a long time. In early May, Weston began building a lean-to beside the cabin. He said it'd keep the tools dry, but Helena noticed him measuring carefully against the wall, the way someone might if they were planning more than just storage. One morning, she found him smoothing a plank of pine with a draw knife. "That doesn't look like it's for tools," she said, arms crossed. He looked up, eyes warm. "No, I was thinking a porch swing. You planning to sit still long enough to use one? If you'll sit beside me." The girls came running then, Bonnie with her braid half undone and Bethany trailing bits of grass from her dress. They circled Weston's legs, jabbering about a bird's nest they'd found in the eaves. Helena watched him crouch to listen, giving them his full attention the way Thomas never had Thomas, who'd loved them, but always with a distance, like he wasn't sure how to hold something so small and needy. Later that evening, as Helena folded linens near the hearth, she glanced toward Weston sketching something on a scrap of feed sack paper. "You always drawing." "Only when I'm thinking." "What about?" He held up the paper. "A rough outline of the cabin with added walls and a second chimney." "What this place could be if I stayed for good." She stared at it a long moment, then came to sit beside him. "You sure?" "I've never been more." Helena reached for his hand. "Then we'll build it together." That night, as the wind settled and the fire dimmed to coals, Weston wrapped an arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, the weight of old grief slipping further away. The air smelled of pine smoke and fresh cut wood, and for the first time in years, Helena didn't brace herself against the future. She welcomed it. By mid-June, the meadow behind the cabin burst into wildflowers, yellow balsam root and pale lupine tall enough to brush the girls' knees when they ran through it. Weston had finished the swing and strung it with thick rope from Helena's cellar. It hung from the beam of the porch, swaying gently even when no one sat in it, like it remembered better times were coming. One morning, Helena found Weston in the barn, rearranging sacks of oats and checking over the leather tack with quiet precision. "You always this particular?" she asked, leaning in the doorway. He set the bridle down and wiped his hands on his trousers. "Only when I plan on staying." She stepped inside, the dust rising in the warm air, and rested a hand on the stall gate. "The girls asked if you'd sleep inside come winter." He didn't answer at first. "You want me to?" "I didn't say that," she replied, tilting her head, "but I didn't say I didn't." He gave the smallest nod and reached for a bucket. "I could put in a partition, make space near the hearth." "Wouldn't crowd you." "You wouldn't," she said. "Not if it's what we're choosing." He looked at her then, something unguarded in his expression. "That what this is?" "I think it's starting to be." That evening, Bonnie helped him shave kindling while Bethany stitched a crooked line through a scrap of muslin Helena had given her. The cabin felt fuller, not just in noise but in shape, like it had grown around this new rhythm without needing permission. After the girls were asleep, Weston sat with Helena on the porch swing, his arm resting behind her. The stars came out late that night, slow and scattered. "You ever think about marrying again?" he asked. The question hung between them like smoke. "I used to tell myself I didn't need to," she said. But that was more about not wanting to lose myself again. I was someone's wife before I was anything else. That kind of thing can erase a woman. He was quiet for a long while, then said, "I wouldn't ask you to disappear." "I know," she said. "That's what makes it different." The next week, Weston rode into town for nails and seed potatoes, promising to be back by nightfall. Helena watched him go from the bluff above the creek, her shawl drawn tight against the breeze. She stayed until the dust from his horse faded into the hills. He returned just before sundown, a satchel slung across his back and a bottle of linseed oil tucked under his arm. "Brought something else," he said, lifting the saddle bag onto the porch. Bonnie was already peeking inside. "What is it?" Weston pulled out a small fiddle, the wood dulled with age but intact. "Belonged to a rancher north of town," he said. "He passed on last winter. His daughter said it ought to be played, not left to collect dust." "You play?" Helena asked, arms crossed but voice light. "I did once. My mother taught me before she got sick." He tuned it slowly that evening, the girls watching with wide eyes. When he drew the bow across the strings, the sound came uncertain at first, then settled, warm and low. He played a waltz Helena half remembered from her own childhood, and she hummed along, not realizing until halfway through that she'd started to smile. Later, as they cleaned up supper, she said, "You could teach the girls." He dried his hands on a cloth. "I'd like that." By July, the cabin had changed. The lean-to was finished, and Weston had built a small bench for the girls under the window so they could sit and read without dragging chairs. He started carving small wooden animals in the evenings, sanding them smooth and painting them with leftover milk paint Helena had tucked away in the cellar. One night, as they lay beneath the quilt she had sewn that first quiet winter, Weston traced a scar near her collarbone with the back of his finger. "How'd that happen?" he asked, voice nearly a whisper. "Trying to pull a calf alone," she said. "Rope snapped. Took me off my feet. You shouldn't have had to do that alone." She turned toward him, her hand resting over his. "I don't anymore." The days lengthened, and the work changed with the season. Weston dug a shallow trench for a root cellar, and Helena taught the girls how to braid onions for storage. In the evenings, they sat on the porch, the girls curled up with their homemade dolls, Weston's arm across the back of the swing, Helena's knee resting against his. One cloudless night, Weston stood up from the porch steps and extended his hand toward her. "Dance with me," he said. "There's no music. I've got enough in my head for two." She rose, barefoot in the dirt, and let him guide her gently in a slow circle. The girls watched from the cabin steps, whispering behind their hands. "You sure this is what you want?" she asked quietly, her hand in his. "There's nothing I'd rather build my life around than this. You, the girls, this land." Helena closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of dry grass and wood smoke. "Then I reckon we can start calling it ours." Weston leaned in, and their foreheads touched. No rush, no uncertainty, just the quiet certainty of two people who had been through enough to know what mattered. They didn't say anything more that night. They didn't need to. The morning of the harvest fair dawned clear, the air sweet with late summer clover and the smoke of early cook fires. Helena tied Bonnie's sash with practiced fingers while Bethany counted the blue stitches on her hem, making sure there were still 24. Weston stood outside with the wagon, brushing down the mare and checking the wheel bolts twice, though he wouldn't admit it was nerves. It was the first time they'd all gone into town together. Helena stepped out last, her shawl folded neatly, a small basket on her arm holding a jar of apple butter and a tin of dried sage. Weston turned when he heard the door and paused, his gaze catching on her face. "You look like sunlight on snow," he said quietly, so the girls wouldn't tease. She offered him the smallest nod. "And you look like a man who's about to split his boots worrying." He chuckled, setting the brake before helping her onto the bench. "I've just never brought a family to a fair before." The girls rode in back, waving to every person they passed, even if they didn't know them. Helena kept a hand on Weston's arm as they rolled into the town square, which was already buzzing with booths and banners, and the sound of a fiddler warming up near the mercantile. Mayor Hollis tipped his hat as they passed. "Didn't expect to see you here, Adler." Helena lifted her chin. "Figured it was time." The girls tugged Weston toward the bobbing for Apple's barrel while Helena found a shady spot near the baked goods table. She hadn't been in a crowd this size since before Thomas died, and for a moment the noise pressed against her like a weight. But then Weston turned and caught her eye, lifting Bethany into the air with both hands while Bonnie cheered, and it lifted. She walked over as he set Bethany down. "You're good with them," she said. "They make it easy," he replied. And loud. "I want you to meet someone," she said, and took his hand. She led him to a woman arranging jars of preserves, her graying braid coiled at the base of her neck. "This is Clara," Helena said. "She was midwife for the girls and helped bury Thomas." Weston offered his hand. "Ma'am." Clara took it with a steady grip. "Been hearing your name around, didn't think you'd be real. I get that often." She studied him a moment, then turned to Helena. "You look well." "I am," Clara nodded once. "Then I'll stop worrying." They wandered the fair for hours. Weston won the girls a pair of painted marbles at the ring toss, and Helena entered her apple butter in the preserves competition with a shrug. "Not like I'm feeding the governor." When the sun began to dip behind the grain elevator, Weston led them to a quiet patch near the edge of town where the grass grew long and the air smelled of fresh cut hay. "I've been meaning to ask something," he said, as the girls chased each other in circles. Helena raised an eyebrow. "You look like you're about to propose selling the horse." He took a breath, then dropped to one knee, pulling a small wooden box from his pocket. "I carved this for you, took the better part of the last snowfall." She opened it. Inside sat a ring, simple and sturdy, the band smooth as river stone and holding a small mountain agate, pale as milk with a thread of gold inside. "I didn't want to ask until I knew you'd had time to choose this life," he said. "But I love you, Helena. Not just for what you are, but for how you've carried what you've lost. I want to build the rest of my days around that kind of strength." She didn't speak right away. Instead, she knelt with him, brushing her fingers over the ring once, then taking his hand. "I've known loss," she said. "But you make the days feel full again, not just bearable. Good, I want this, all of it, with you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like it had always belonged there. From behind them, Bonnie shouted, "Did he ask you?" "Mama, did he?" Helena stood, holding Weston's hand. "He did." Bethany grinned. "And you said yes." "I did." The girls whooped and ran to them, wrapping their arms around their waists. Weston bent to lift them both, laughing as they tugged at his collar and asked a dozen questions all at once. They rode home under a sky turning dusky blue, the breeze warm on their faces. Helena leaned against Weston's shoulder, the girls dozing in the back. She looked up at the stars slipping into view and felt, for the first time in years, that nothing was unfinished. They were wed on the first Sunday of September, with Clara standing beside Helena and the girls scattering late summer petals from their aprons. Weston wore his best shirt, which Helena had mended without telling him, and the ring he slipped on her finger matched hers, carved from the same cedar he'd used to build the swing. Afterward, they ate cornbread and blackberry pie on the porch while the girls clambered over the fence rail, and Weston played a slow tune on the fiddle as the sun set behind the ridge. Later, when the sky turned dark and the girls were tucked into bed, Helena stood with Weston beneath the lean-to, arms wrapped around each other. "I never thought I'd have this again," she whispered. "You didn't," he said. "You built it." She kissed him without hesitation, her hands steady at the back of his neck. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, then fell silent. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, and the home they'd made stood strong around them, walls mended, hearts healed, and a new beginning shaped by quiet choices and hard-earned love. They stayed side by side for all their years, raising the girls into women who knew laughter and safety and the sound of fiddle strings on summer nights. And every evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees, they sat on the swing Weston had built, their hands twined together, the silence between them full of peace.